Part 9, County Limerick, July 1847. The summer sun had returned to Ireland. For the first time in years, the fields looked as though they remembered what they were supposed to do. Not everywhere, not for everyone. There were still empty cottages, still abandoned farms, still graves in churchyards that had filled far too quickly. But there were signs, small signs, the kind people had learned to treasure. A green field, a full hedgerow, a child laughing. The Keane garden had become a source of pride. It wasn't large. It would never produce enough to make them wealthy. But it produced something far more valuable: independence. Breda no longer counted every oath with desperation. She still counted them. Old habits learned in famine did not disappear immediately. But now she counted because she was careful, not because she was afraid. Seamus had taken responsibility for the garden as though it were a farm 10 times its size. Each morning he checked the plants. Every evening he inspected the leaves. "That one isn't looking well," Breda smiled. "You're becoming like your father." The boy looked up. Was Dad good at growing things? He was. What else was he good at? Breda paused. There were so many answers. He was good at noticing when people needed help. Seamus thought about that. Before they asked? Yes. How? She smiled sadly. I never knew. A few miles away, Edward sat across from his father at breakfast. The conversation began as ordinary: the weather, the estate, the harvest. Then his father placed a letter on the table. "Your writing expenses have increased." Edward looked up. "I'm sorry." "Your accounts." The older man tapped the paper. "You've been purchasing supplies." Edward remained silent. His father studied him. "Why?" For a moment, Edward considered lying. Then he remembered Seamus. He remembered the notebook. He remembered the words. A man was measured by who slept easier because he was alive. "I've been helping people." His father leaned back. "Which people?" Edward didn't answer. That was answer enough. "Edward?" The boy looked up. "You must understand something." His father's voice was not angry. That almost made it harder. "Good intentions do not fix the world." No. But they can create expectations. Edward frowned. Expectations. Dependence. The word hung in the room. Edward looked down. He had heard it before, from men who believed hunger was a moral failing. But now the word sounded different, colder. "If someone is starving," Edward said carefully, "is giving them food creating dependence?" His father was silent. Finally he replied, "Sometimes." Edward looked toward the window. Outside, workers moved through the estate fields. People his father called tenants. People Edward now saw as neighbours. That evening, Edward rode to the village, not with food, not with supplies, just himself. He stopped outside the church. Father O'Donovan was waiting. "You've had a difficult conversation." Edward looked surprised. "How did you know?" The priest smiled. "Because every person who begins to see the world differently eventually discovers that others may not see it with them." Edward sat on the stone steps. "My father says helping people can make them dependent." The priest nodded. "Can it?" Edward considered. "Perhaps. But is that the only danger?" The priest shook his head. "No." "What is the other?" "Allowing people to suffer because you fear helping them incorrectly." Edward looked at him. The priest continued. "Your father sees the risk of charity, and you? I see the risk of losing compassion." That night, Edward prepared another parcel, but this time something felt different. He was no longer only thinking about Breda. He was thinking about all the people he had passed on the roads, all the empty cottages, all the children searching fields. The Keanes were the beginning, not the end. When he reached the cottage, something unexpected happened. Before he could place the parcel down, the door opened. Breda stood there. Edward froze. For one terrifying moment, neither moved. Then a small voice came from behind. "Ma'am?" Breda turned slightly. Edward stepped backward into the darkness. She looked toward the trees. "Hello?" No answer, only the wind. After several moments, she stepped outside. The parcel was there. She looked down, then toward the shadows. "Whoever you are." Her voice was gentle. "You don't need to hide from me." Edward held his breath. She continued, "I don't need your name. I only want you to know," her voice cracked slightly, "you saved my children's lives." Edward looked away. He had heard gratitude before, from servants, from people impressed by his family name. This was different. This was gratitude with no expectation, no desire for favour, only truth. Breda picked up the parcel. Then she noticed something, a small mark on the cloth, the same stitching as before, the same letter, E. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Edward saw her notice. He knew. The secret was becoming impossible to keep. Later that night, Edward sat beside the river, the place where everything had begun. He opened Seamus's notebook. The page was worn now from being read so many times. He ran his fingers over the words. A man is not measured by what he owns, but by who sleeps easier because he was alive today. Edward looked across the water, and for the first time he wondered something. Not whether he would be discovered, not whether his father would approve, but whether Seamus would approve. And strangely, he felt the answer. The next morning, Breda visited Father O'Donovan. She carried the embroidered cloth with her. "I think I know." The priest looked at it. "Do you?" She nodded. "I think our angel is someone close." "Someone you know?" "Perhaps." The priest smiled. "And what will you do?" Breda looked toward the estate. "I will wait." "Why?" "Because whoever he is," she said, "he has given without asking anything in return." She folded the cloth carefully. "The least I can do is give him the same kindness." Far away, Edward stood at the edge of the estate grounds, looking toward the little cottage. For months he had hidden because he feared being known. Now he wondered whether hiding was still the right thing. Because Seamus Keane had never hidden from suffering, he had run towards it. And perhaps, just perhaps, Edward was ready to do the same. Part 10. County Limerick, August 1847. Edward had always believed there was one river separating people. The actual river. The one that ran through the estate. The one where he had fallen. The one where Seamus Keane had saved him. But he was beginning to understand there was another river, a wider one, a deeper one. The distance between those who had enough and those who did not. The estate house had always seemed enormous to Edward. As a child, he had never questioned it. The high ceilings, the polished floors, the rooms that remained empty even when guests were not visiting. The servants who appeared before anyone asked. It had simply been life. Now, walking through these same halls, he noticed things differently. The dining table could seat 20 people. The village had families who could not afford one proper meal. The kitchen discarded more food in a week than some cottages saw in a month. He had begun seeing the world behind the walls. At dinner one evening, several guests visited the estate. Edward sat quietly while the adults spoke. The conversation moved from politics to harvests, then inevitably the famine. "The trouble," one gentleman said, "is that people have become accustomed to assistance." Another nodded. "Precisely. Once you give too freely, they expect it." Edward looked down at his plate. The words bothered him, not because they were entirely false, because they were incomplete. He wondered if these men had ever looked in the eyes of a hungry child. One of the guests noticed Edward's silence. "Young man, you're unusually quiet tonight." Edward looked up. "Am I?" The men laughed. "You've been listening, perhaps." The older gentleman smiled. "Then what do you think?" Edward hesitated. Every instinct told him to remain silent. Children were meant to listen, not challenge. Especially not in front of adults. Especially not adults of his own class. Then he remembered Seamus, a man who had jumped into a river because someone needed him. "I think," Edward began carefully, "that hunger changes how people behave." The room became quieter. The gentleman raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "A person who steals food may not be greedy." Edward looked around the table. "They may simply be starving." One of the men shifted uncomfortably. Another laughed. "You sound like a priest." Edward replied softly, "No. I sound like someone who has been hungry." The room fell silent because everyone knew he had not. After dinner, his father found him outside. "You embarrassed yourself tonight." Edward lowered his head. "I know." "Do you?" His father sighed. "You're young." Edward looked up. "I am." "Young people see suffering and believe they can fix it. Can they not?" His father looked down toward the darkened fields. "No." A pause. "Not alone." Edward considered this, then nodded. "Perhaps not." His father seemed surprised, but... Edward looked toward the village beyond the estate. "But someone has to try." The next day, Edward visited Father O'Donovan. "I think I understand now." The priest looked up from his papers. "Understand what?" "Why people don't change." The priest smiled sadly. "That's a very old question." Edward sat down. "Because changing means admitting you were wrong. Sometimes. And people don't like that." "No." "Even when they are." The priest nodded, "especially then." That afternoon, Edward rode toward the Keane cottage. Before reaching it, he stopped. Something caught his attention. A family beside the road, a mother, 2 children, a small bundle of possessions beside them. They had been evicted. Edward dismounted. The mother looked frightened. "Please, sir, we are moving on." "I only wanted to help." She stared at him, not with gratitude, with suspicion. Edward understood why. Too many people with power had approached them before. Too many promises had been broken. "What is your name?" She hesitated. "Margaret Doyle." Edward nodded. "Mrs. Doyle." He paused, then removed his gloves. "I cannot fix what happened." The woman looked surprised. He continued, "But I can make sure you do not walk hungry today." He offered her the food he had brought, not for Breda, for them. For the first time, Edward understood something important. Kindness was not a secret gift. It was a way of seeing. That evening he arrived at the Keane cottage without a parcel. Breda noticed immediately. Something happened. Edward froze. She smiled gently. "You have the look of someone carrying a heavy thought." He looked at her. For a moment he wondered if she knew, not everything, but enough. "I met a family today." He told her about the Doyles. Breda listened quietly, and when he finished, she nodded. "You helped them?" "Yes." "Good." Edward looked down. "But I had meant to bring food here. And instead, I gave it away." Breda smiled. "Then you gave exactly where it was needed." He looked at her. "I thought you might be upset." "Why?" "Because you needed it." She looked toward the cottage. "We have eaten because someone helped us." A pause. "Perhaps today someone else ate because you helped them." Edward felt the words settle deeply. That night before leaving, he stood by the doorway. Breda watched him carefully. "Whoever you are," she said quietly, "I hope you know something." Edward remained still. "What?" "You're becoming the kind of person who would have saved my husband." The word struck him harder than he expected, because that was exactly what he had wanted. Not to be wealthy, not admired, not important, just worthy. Later, beneath the old oak tree, Edward opened Seamus's notebook. He read the sentence again, then he closed the book. For the first time, he didn't need to look at the words. He already knew them. And he finally understood. Seamus Keane was no longer just a man who had saved him. He was the measure by which Edward judged himself.